It's always an honor and a privilege to be at Quarry Farm. It's an unusual experience because I feel so gratified to be here and privileged, and yet every time I've come, I felt right at home. So it's one of those comfortable kinds of privileges that one rarely encounters. My family and I spent a little bit of a summer of 1992 here, and I recall quite vividly and fondly walking the grounds with Jervis Langdon, whose idea this was, and getting to know him well and miss him very much. I want to thank Barb Snedeker, and I know why you're here. This is her birthday, by the way. So, oops. Okay, I'll keep. And thank Elmira College, Center of Mark Twain Studies, Tim Morgan, and all of those others who are involved in such a thing as this. And thank you for coming out in inclement weather. I never use the word inclement, except when it comes with weather. That's a strange word. It only pops up from the rain. I read this paper over this morning and decided it wasn't funny enough. So I'm going to begin with a joke, actually. It's not in the paper itself. I like the joke, you may not, and I may be starting off the wrong foot, but it is actually designed to for a purpose. The joke goes something like this. It's not Twain's joke. A man's walking out in the desert and stumbles upon a lamp, picks it up and rubs it, and sure enough, a genie pops out and says, "Hello, master, I'm here to grant you 3 wishes." The man says, "Great, great." The genie says, "Hold on now, there's a catch." "What's the catch?" "Well, whatever you wish for, your worst enemy in the whole world will get 2 of." The man says, "It's fine with me. I'm not a mean and spiteful person." "Sure. Okay, you understand the terms." He says, yes, go ahead. "Okay, well, what's your first wish?" He says, "I want $1 million. Genie says, "It is deposited in a Swiss bank account right now, even as we speak. But you realize that your worst enemy, yes, I understand, he's got $2 million. I got the premise. Well, what's your second wish?" He says, "I want a brand new red Mercedes. It's in your garage, even as you speak, but your enemy now has, yes, I understand, he has 2. Well, what's your third and final wish?" And he says, "You know, I always wanted to donate a kidney." No. I like that joke, sorry to say. But it's not absolutely gratuitous, because one of the ideas that I touch on briefly here, and this is a shorthand way of explaining it, is I think it's a moral joke. And it's a moral joke in a funny kind of way, in a way that I think Twain would have appreciated. First of all, our benefactor of the 3 wishes acted selfishly. I mean, what could be more delicious than getting revenge on your worst enemy, with or without genie? But in any case, when you think about it, it is a selfish act. But if you calculate, 4 people live and only 1 dies. It is, to use the language of John Stuart Mill and utilitarianism, which is the idea I wish to illustrate, it is the greatest good for the greatest number. And it's motivated by a certain kind of selfishness that has positive consequences. You might bear that in mind, because I will touch upon that idea from time to time in this paper, which is called How Mark Twain Changed His Very Own Mind. And the descriptions make it sound more limited than I hope it is, at least by the time I get there. I bought 2 sets of glasses to see which one's going to work. This one will work for a while anyway. Okay. As some of you may know, I recently published a book with the title Mark Twain and Human Nature. Martin Zare wrote a very kind review of the book for the Mark Twain Forum. But in an email to me, asked somewhat rhetorically, I assume, why in hell wasn't this written before now? Pardon his profanity. I have pondered that question a good deal since he wrote me. After all, it's a rather obvious subject. I know why I wrote it, but I don't know why other people didn't write it. Twain had a lifelong interest in his fellow human creatures, and at length formulated what he came to call his gospel, most fully expounded in his quasi-Socratic dialogue, What is Man?, published anonymously, by the way, and actually expanded and refined in subsequent writings to that, which you can ask me about if you wish after this talk. In any case, the title of Twain's work is, I suppose, another rhetorical question, because he was convinced that he had the answer. So, in brief, one reason no one wrote the sort of book I attempted to write may be that not only is the subject obvious, but that it had already been written by Twain himself. My interest in the subject differed from Twain's own in certain respects, however. For one thing, I was curious how a Missouri boy outgrew certain prepossessions. Among them, a bigotry against African Americans, Native Americans, non-Americans, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and probably Unitarians. For another, in the 19th century, conflicting theories about human nature proliferated and competed for one's allegiance. Yet Mark Twain seems to have adapted himself to these changes with relative equanimity. In a word, over the course of a lifetime, Mark Twain changed his mind about many things, and actually he changed it several times. He also changed his tune on women's suffrage, trade unions, the Republican Party, phrenology, American adventurism abroad, Christian missionaries, capital punishment. I could go on. This is not news, though it is remarkable. After all, most people settle into established opinions about things well before middle age and tend to stay put. Not so with Mark Twain. He was a relentlessly curious man, and somewhat to my surprise, I've come to believe he was a rigorous thinker as well. Is there some principle that might explain in a coherent way most, if not all, of these shifts in his thinking? If not, we are naturally disposed to think him mercurial, even whimsical in his opinions. And in fact, his own daughter Clara one time said that she was always astounded at how many opinions Mark Twain had on virtually everything. There is, anyway, and to my thinking, such a principle stated succinctly in both Connecticut Yankee and Pudd'nhead Wilson. Training is everything. Well before those statements, however, he had declared to the Wednesday Evening Club on February 19th, 1883, in a speech he named What is Happiness, that, and I am quoting, the human machine gets all its inspirations from the outside and is not capable of originating an idea of any kind in its own head, and that no man ever does a duty for duty's sake, but only for the sake of avoiding the personal discomfort he would have to endure if he shirked the duty. It appears that the most conspicuous and effective form of discomfort, for Twain at least, is shame. I will give two brief examples. As early as 1879, Twain recorded in his notebook simply, I disfavor capital punishment. He gave no reason then for his altered view, but 8 or 9 years later, in another notebook entry, he elaborated. All crimes should be punished with humiliations. Hanging is not based on knowledge of human nature, he continued. When the death penalty was instituted, revenge was the object, and passionate, quick revenge. But now our object is deterrent, not punitive. And again, quoting from Twain, shave a woman criminal's head and make her wear rubber tubing back of both lips, and stop there. She would rather be in hell. Even earlier, in the manuscript Tom Sawyer, Twain made an important revision that indicates his disinclination to admit claims of inherent or innate qualities according to race, but also the powerful effects of shame. At one point, the half-breed Injun Joe's particular brand of cruelty is attributed to the Indian side of his character. The Welshman says of Joe's plan to slit the widow's nostrils and notch her ears, quote, "White men don't take that sort of revenge, but an Injun, that's a different matter altogether." Even Joe says of his desire for revenge upon Dr. Robinson, "The Injun blood ain't in me for nothing." Twain's anti-Indian sentiments are familiar, but that he would have us believe that there is a distinct and distinctly perverse Indian nature is more doubtful. Though Twain was originally content to explain Joe's evil character as a product of race, he apparently emphatically rejected that explanation in revision. Most of Joe's motivation for revenge has to do with his sense of wounded pride. Dr. Robinson's father had Joe jailed for vagrancy. The widow Douglas' husband had also had Joe arrested for vagrancy. But Joe adds, and this is the passage that was added, "And that ain't all. It ain't a millionth part of it. He had me horsewhipped. Horsewhipped in front of the jail like a nigger, with all the town looking on. Horsewhipped. Do you understand?" Twain inserted this passage on the back of page 713 of the manuscript. And the punctuation alone, 3 dashes, the word horsewhipped in italics in one place and all capitals in another, and 7 exclamation points, signals the emphasis he wants to give it. Joe's blood finally has nothing to do with his behavior or motivation, his sense of public humiliation, everything. What I want to convey here is that Twain could and did modify his opinions on capital punishment and Indian nature and other things out of a steadfast adherence to his ever-developing thought concerning human nature as a product of outside influences. The mechanism whereby humiliation works such transformative effects on individuals was stated in jocular fashion in a late essay, Cornpone Opinions. Every individual is essentially selfish, he maintained, and what he or she wants more than anything else is a sense of self-approval. However, the only way one can come by that approval is through the approval of others. The echo effect of this feeling of self-regard allows for all manner of deficiencies in the damned human race: mob mentality, moral cowardice, what Twain called the lie of silent assertion, and so forth. But it may foster excellencies as well. In the curious Republic of Gondor, it's a utopian little sketch of Twain's, the franchise is enlarged so that all citizens with property have more votes than those without, and those with superior education can outvote those with wealth. Pretty soon after that law is enacted, even the young hanker after a better education because it confers greater political power and higher public regard. In Gondor, many women sit in parliament, and twice women were elected to the position of Grand Caliph, the highest office in the land. Gender has nothing to do with capacity. Training is everything. Twain's so-called gospel is a deterministic philosophy, of course. And there are those who have claimed that when push came to shove, there was a part of Twain that simply did not believe his own creed. Among them, the highly distinguished critics Walter Blair, Henry Nash Smith, Sherwood Cummings. They would maintain, and did maintain, that Huck's so-called moral decision in chapter 31 of the novel that bears the boy's name, where Huck declares his willingness to go to hell and decides to help Jim to freedom, dramatizes an intuitive and selfless moral sympathy out of keeping with Twain's announced determinism. Likewise, there is an inclination among many to believe that Twain himself changed his mind concerning African Americans in the ways that argue for a broadening of his own sympathies, in ways that are anything but selfish. I would claim quite the opposite, however, that it was Twain's allegiance to certain utilitarian principles, along with his capacity to draw logical inferences, that permitted him to jettison the prepossessions of his early days and to take on a more ample, and we would like to say a more enlightened perspective concerning matters of race and gender, and other things as well. Time permitting, I'll be happy to elaborate on this point after the talk. But now let me concentrate on the announced emphasis of the lecture. And I should say at the outset that that emphasis, that is Twain's changing his attitude toward temporary insanity, or the plea for temporary insanity, is not something I took up in my book on Twain and human nature in any direct way, though it was latent in the prevailing argument of the book. Furthermore, it serves as a barometer in gauging Twain's shifting point of view. But because it is also something out of the way, it is not so charged with controversy or predisposed feelings of his attitudes towards race and gender, for example. Thus, we may inspect this topic with greater detachment, perhaps, than we might with other subjects. The only, by the way, I don't know how you feel about the temporary insanity play, but it's not a real current issue, although I did see a cartoon just last week, a woman on the witness stand being tried for murder, and she confesses to the murder of her husband, saying, "It was his constant snoring that caused me to do it." And the jury, little bubbles over the head to indicate their thinking, saying, "He had it coming." And another one saying, "A clear case of temporary insanity." So there are still people who, I guess, worry about such matters. But I chose it because it's not something we much talk about anymore. In any case, in 1870, a recent court case that admitted temporary insanity as a defense strategy resulted in acquittal and excited angry satire in Twain. In that year, 1870, Twain published 3 sketches: The New Crime, Our Precious Lunatic, and Unburlesquable Things, damning the defense of murderers on the grounds of temporary insanity, and he made casual reference to it elsewhere. In The New Crime, the essay, he sarcastically remarked, "Is not this insanity plea becoming rather common? Of late years, it does seem possible for a man to so conduct himself, does not seem possible for a man to so conduct himself before killing another man as not to be manifestly insane. If he talks about the stars, he is insane. If he appears nervous and uneasy an hour before the killing, he is insane. If he weeps over a great grief, his friends shake their head and fear that he is not right. If an hour after the murder he seems ill at ease, preoccupied and excited, he is unquestionably insane. Really, what we want now is not laws against crime, but a law against insanity. That's where the true evil lies." One might think that Twain's outburst in these 3 separate pieces on the same subject the same year would have permitted Twain to get the whole business out of his system. Not so. He recurred to it again and again over an extended period of time. Most immediately, in May 1871, after he completed writing chapter 48 of Roughing It, in which he lambasted the whole idea of trial by jury as a mockery of justice and a model example of imbecility, Twain wrote his publisher with an idea for the dedication of this new book. And here's the proposed dedication. "To the late Cain, this book is dedicated, not on account of respect for his memory, for it merits little respect, not on account of sympathy with him, for his bloody deed placed him without the pale of sympathy, strictly speaking, but out of a mere humane commiseration for him, that it was his misfortune to live in a dark age that knew not the benevolent insanity plea." The editors of the California edition of Roughing It have surmised that Twain must have been somewhat giddy when he proposed that dedication. And Louis J. Budd has rather generously described the idea as uninspired. However, in a curious way, the dedication is revealing. By rehearsing Twain's attitudes toward temporary insanity as legal defense, as they related to Roughing It, I may be appearing to trivialize one of Twain's better and certainly more important books. But in an odd and roundabout way, the issue reaches to the very heart of the book and sheds some light on Clemens's life at this time, as well as on the solidity of his persona, Mark Twain, and how it had acquired that solidity. It also points to an irony that may have been wholly lost on Clemens himself. The author would have his readers believe that the wayward life Sam Clemens had led circa 1860 to 1867 was in part induced by temporary insanity. And this is Twain writing. By and by I was smitten with the silver fever, he wrote in chapter 26. Everyone was getting rich, or so it seemed, and Twain got caught up in the excitement. I would have been more or less than human if I had not gone mad like the rest. Cartloads of solid silver bricks as large as pigs of lead were arriving from the mills every day, and such sights as that gave substance to the wild talk about me. I succumbed and grew as frenzied as the craziest. What is more, Twain expects the reader to identify with his situation and therefore forgive him his excesses. For, quote, the reader may see what moved me and what is surely would have moved him had he been there. It is clear from comments he later made in what Paul Bourget thinks of us, that Twain came to believe this form of madness is universally human. Quote, the world seems to think that the love of money is American and that the mad desire to get suddenly rich is American. I believe that both of these things are merely and broadly human, not American monopolies at all. The love of money is natural to all nations, for money is a good and strong friend. Then he recurs to his Western years as evidence. In the flush times in the silver regions, a cook or any other humble worker stood a very good chance to get rich out of a trifle of money risked in a stock deal. And that person promptly took the risk, no matter what his or her nationality might be. I was there. I saw it. To the degree that roughing it is an imaginative effort at self-extenuation, a public accounting for the follies of his salad years, very much like his private efforts to convince the Langdon family that he was worthy of Olivia, Twain's defense is that he contracted a momentary madness due to a peculiar set of circumstances. Kind of like those T-shirts that say, the devil made me do it. His concluding moral of the book is cautionary, because it is not wise to subject frail human natures to such temptations. If you are of any account, stay at home and make your way by faithful diligence. But if you are no account, go away from home, and then you will have to work, whether you want to or not. Thus you become a blessing to your friends by ceasing to be a nuisance to them. The author has earned his right to speak in this way because he has transcended his tenderfoot years and has attained to a moral and social respectability. The voice of Mark Twain here and elsewhere in the book is the voice of an older and wiser man. He is now of some account and therefore someone who should be forgiven the follies of an earlier day. Perhaps Samuel Clemens should have listened to Mark Twain in this instance. Clemens, at any rate, was foolish to believe that he was rid of the desire to become suddenly rich. The subsequent record of his inventions, investments, and harebrained schemes to make a bundle throughout his life indicates that he had not outgrown those feverish desires. And Mark Twain, as literary persona, would return to this theme again and again. But he would also contemplate the whole notion of temporary insanity. And, as with other subjects on which he reversed himself, this one seems to derive from a steadfast attachment to his gospel. One begins to see the breaking up of his position on this issue in this Gilded Age, the novel he and Charles Dudley Warner wrote together. In the proposed defense of Laura Hawkins, who was killed the man that pretended to marry her. In the proposed defense of Laura Hawkins to the jury, her lawyer lays out the lines of his proposed argument. And this is the lawyer speaking. It is my duty, gentlemen, to unfold to you one of the most affecting dramas in all the history of misfortune. I shall have to show you a life, the sport of fate and circumstances, hurried along through shifting storm and sun, bright with trusting innocence and anon black with heartless villainy, a career which moves on in love and desertion and anguish, always hovered over by the dark specter of insanity. An insanity hereditary and induced by mental torture until it ends, if end it must, in your verdict by one of those fearful accidents which are inscrutable to men and of which God alone knows the secret. Part of the plot of the novel involves locating Laura Hawkins' father, who they think, just by legend, is mad, is crazy. And so Laura worries that she has inherited the father's madness that father's never discovered. So it's kind of a false lead in that sense. Anyway, that specter, which I just spoken, is the supposed insanity of Laura's biological father. We've already seen that that Twain would reject in the character of Injun Joe the argument that certain traits, a mad desire for revenge in this case, are a product of the blood and not of outward circumstance. Even in the Gilded Age, Twain wavers on this subject. On the one hand, he is dismissive of the temporary insanity defense, but on the other, he expresses deep doubts about criminal insanity as a product of heredity. He does this in a rather ingenious fashion by introducing a few paragraphs in which Laura is conducted to the state hospital for insane criminals and there realizes the greater misfortune of her sentence. Imprisoned among the truly mad, quote, she wondered if she were not mad. She felt that she soon should be among these loathsome creatures. Better almost to have died than to slowly go mad in this confinement. I say this is ingenious because Twain promptly withdraws this description because this is a work of history and not of fiction, he says. For the law provides no such sentence. And in fact, Laura doesn't go to the asylum at all. She walks free. Instead of being bound in a straitjacket, she goes on the lecture circuit. For Twain, this may have been an inside joke, given that he thought lecturing itself was its own form of torture. Twain is not done with the subject, far from it. And Tom Sawyer, for example, is the intention of Muff Potter's attorney to prove that our client did this fearful deed while under the influence of a blind and irresponsible delirium produced by drink. He changes his mind, of course, when Tom Sawyer comes forward as an eyewitness to the murder that even Potter himself believed he committed. Twain touches on the same subject in subsequent novels as well. Among the many parallels between Huckleberry Finn and The Prince and the Pauper, for example, is the resemblance between Pap and the Mad Hermit. Actually, in terms of composition, he wrote Pap's bout with delirium tremens before he began Prince and the Pauper, although he finished Prince and the Pauper before he finished Huckleberry Finn. So Pap is the model for the hermit, in other words. In his wanderings, Edward encounters a hermit who believes himself to be an archangel. Even so, the hermit is not satisfied and has his complaint against the government. For had it not been for Edward's father, Henry VIII, the man believes he would have been Pope. Similarly, it's a weird idea for a Pope. Similarly, Pap rails against the government for taking his son away from him and failing to recognize his rights as a white male, but mostly for the $6,000 that he believes is rightfully his. And both men resolve to exact a holy vengeance on the boys. In one of Twain's satiric inversions, the men act in the manner of Abraham and mean to kill the boys with a knife in sacrificial fashion. Neither, of course, is compelled by divine authority. Instead, they are enraged by a sense of being ill-used by political authority. Surely there's humorous irony involved when Twain created a murderously insane hermit who scourges his body, eats crumbs, and drinks nothing but water, and had him recreate the part of Pap, a filthy man clothed in rags, but not for reasons of self-mortification, and who lives for, and so as far as we know, may well live on 40-rod whiskey. In any event, in dramatic terms, the way up is the way down. The hermit's lunatic piety and Pap's delirium tremens amount to the same thing. In light of Twain's persistent interest in somewhat vacillating opinions about the insanity defense, it is perhaps of some interest that had either men succeeded in killing a boy, the act would have been defensible as an act of insanity. Temporary in the case of Pap, rather more permanent, it appears, in the case of Hermit. Elsewhere in The Prince and the Pauper, Tom Canty, sitting in judgment as the prince, considers the case of a woman who supposedly sold herself to the devil and caused a terrible storm through her powers. And Tom asks, "Suffer the woman also by the storm?" "Indeed she did, your majesty, and most righteously, as all aver. Her habitation was swept away, and herself and child left shelterless. Methinks the power to do herself so ill a turn was dearly bought. She had been cheated had she paid but for the farthing for it, that she paid her soul, and her child's argueth that she is mad. If she is mad, she knoweth not what she doth, therefore sinneth not." The elderly heads nodded recognition of Tom's wisdom once more, and one individual murmured, "And the king be mad himself, according to report. Then it is a madness of a sort that would improve the sanity of some, I wot of, if by gentle providence of God they could but catch it." One can see, I trust, that Twain's concern with the subject borders on the obsessive, and that his attitude has shifted a great deal. Certainly Tom Canty's sympathies are with the woman here, and so are Twain's. If, as Twain's reasoning goes, man is an automaton who originates nothing from within, then even under the best of circumstances, man is not a rational animal who makes free moral choices. Instead, we are all ruled by outside influences and actuated by sometimes quite irrational impulses. As Pudd'nhead Wilson Riley remarks in Following the Equator, if the desire to kill and the opportunity to kill came always together, who would escape hanging? The threat of hanging, at any rate, is not likely to serve as deterrent so effectively as the removal of opportunity and a respect for law, cultivated to the extent that it becomes habitual. Twain could be quite jocular about the mechanics of human behavior, as in his notebook entry made in 1879 when he was writing A Tramp Abroad. And this is his notebook entry. You probably recognize the figure in clocks, European usually. Twain writes, "The bronze man on the clock tower once killed a workman with his hammer. It is said he was tried and acquitted because he did it without premeditation. Not so. He had been getting ready for an hour." I love that because Twain did it for his own amusement. He never published that remark. But it's revealing also. If, according to Twain's reasoning, we are all bronze men, built of an intricate system of habits and impulses, acquired as adaptations to external influence, it is as ridiculous, not to say unjust, to bring an individual to trial and to judgment as if there were no mitigating, even explanatory circumstances. Where social justice is concerned, society itself should be on trial. Adolphe Quetelet, the father of statistics, and a thinker whose treatise on man Twain probably at least knew about, argued on the basis of a mass of data on murders and suicides and many other occurrences that, and I'm quoting Quetelet here, "Society prepares the crime, and the guilty are only the instruments by which it is executed. Hence it happens that the unfortunate person who loses his head on the scaffold, or who ends his life in prison, is in some manner an expiatory victim for society. His crime is the result of the circumstances in which he is found placed." We can see that Twain has traveled a great distance from those original outbursts against the insanity plea, and the vehicle that carried him that distance had more to do with thinking through the implications of how the human creature is constituted than it did with some sentimental weakening of his own original position. In any rate, Twain was more and more inclined to put society and social conditioning on trial than the individual, the mere instrument of the crime, but not the perpetrator of it. By the time he finished A Connecticut Yankee, as Sherwood Cummings has observed, Twain had abandoned any deistic conception of the universe, and this is Cummings speaking. Instead of nature's being a benevolent system, it was an insane process. Instead of it being a gift from above, it was an arena for an evolution that after 1 billion years resulted in the unprofitable outcome called man. At moments in A Connecticut Yankee, when Hank Morgan has had it with his fellow bipeds, he confesses, there are times when one would like to hang the whole human race and finish the farce. As a rule, at least in the early going, Hank's better instincts prevail, evidenced by his so-called man factory, where I am going to turn groping and grubbing automata into men. The insanity plea appears once again in this novel when Hank works to spare Hugo, who had killed one of Morgan Le Fay's deer, and thereby was to die and to leave his widow to become propertyless. Hank cannot make the Queen see that the man's acts were the result of a, quote, sudden passion, just as were her own when she wantonly killed the page. Confound her, I couldn't make her see that sudden passion is an extenuating circumstance in the killing of venison or of a person. So I gave it up and let her sulk it out. Moreover, the Queen refuses to see her act as a crime at all. Besides, she means to pay for the boy. Hank's exasperation with the state of things prepares for this his often quoted passage that begins, "Training is everything," in chapter 18. Reluctantly, Twain has to admit that his fury notwithstanding, even Morgan Le Fay is exempt from judgment. And this is Hank. No, confound her, her intellect was good. She had brains enough. But her training made her an ass, that is, from a many centuries point of view. To kill the page was no crime, it was her right. And upon her right she stood serenely and unconscious of offense. She was a result of generations of training in the unexamined and unassailed belief that the law which permitted her to kill a subject when she chose was a perfectly right and righteous one. I could push this line of inquiry still further, I suppose. In 1901, for example, after President McKinley had been shot, but before he died, Twain wrote Joseph Twitchell about the public reaction to the assassin. This is Twain. Under the unsettling effects of powerful emotion, the talkers are saying wild things, crazy things. They're out of themselves and do not know it. They are temporarily insane. Yet with one voice, they declare the assassin sane. Why, no one is sane straight along, year in and year out, and we all know it. An immense upheaval of feeling can at any time topple us distinctly over the sanity line for a little while. And then if our form happens to be of the murderous sort, we must look out, and so must the spectator. As I say, I could go on in this vein, but that is probably not necessary. I hope I've established that in regard to the insanity defense, Mark Twain had indeed changed his very own mind. However, doing that fulfills only half of the promise of my title. I have not sufficiently commented on how he did this, and I want to close by briefly discussing this troublesome how. At first blush, it appears I have painted myself into a corner. To clarify, if training is everything, if the human creature originates nothing and is buffeted about by outside influences and unlooked-for circumstances, how did Twain himself achieve such changes of attitudes? And as I say, these changes occurred on many fronts. After all, to cite but a single instance, William Dean Howells observed that Twain was the most de-Southernized Southerner he'd ever known. How, then, did Twain emancipate himself from this condition, if you consider being Southerner a condition? But I'm in New York, I can say that, right? One way out of the conundrum I am identifying is to say that Twain's so-called gospel was erected bit by bit to assuage his temporary temporarily guilty conscience, and, temperamentally guilty conscience, and that there was a part of him, and that the better part, that simply did not subscribe to his own creed. Others have taken that road, but to make that sort of argument disallows Twain's moral intelligence. And to do that is ultimately to trivialize his conclusions about insanity and many other subjects, race, for example, in which we are more vitally interested, or so it seems to me. A rather different argument is to say, as I have been saying it rather obliquely, that Mark Twain, having arrived at certain convictions about human nature, that training is everything, to once again use that shorthand phrase to comprehend a whole set of premises, simply drew inferences from that belief. Where Twain came by this belief probably doesn't matter. He may have acquired it as a boy from a slave named Jerry, as he indicates in the late essay, Cornpone Opinions. Or it may have been suggested to him by a man named McFarlane in a Cincinnati boarding house, as he insists in the essay that bears that man's name. However, both Jerry and McFarlane may have been inventions of Twain himself, concocted in order to give the impression that a definite and nameable outside influence came into his possession. I myself am relying on an essay by Charles Saunders Peirce entitled The Fixation of Belief. It was published in Popular Science Monthly in 1877, and there's a distinct possibility that Twain might have read it. In any case, Peirce, in The Old Man of What is Man, that Socratic dialogue in which Twain articulates his gospel, are in fundamental agreement on many key points, and here they are. That human beings are basically selfish. That the tyranny of majority opinion imprisons all but the most steadfastly courageous. That a tenacious belief is not obstinacy, so long as it is continually tested, as it must be, against fact and experience, and modified to fit the facts. That actions taken in accordance with that belief result in practical consequences in the world. That we are ruled by habits of mind, and that insofar as reasoning is concerned, we, like the animals, are merely capable of drawing inferences. Peirce is insistent on this last point, and in What is Man, Twain is too. The Old Man argues that, quote, a dumb animal's mental machine is just the same as a man's, and its reasoning process is the same. I will illustrate further, he says. If you should hand Mr. Edison, that is Thomas Edison, a box in which you have caused to fly open by some concealed device, he would infer a spring and would hunt for it and find it. Now, an uncle of mine had an old horse who used to get into the closed lot where the corn crib was and dishonestly take the corn. I got the punishment myself, as it was supposed that I had heedlessly failed to insert the wooden pin which kept the gate closed. These persistent punishments fatigued me. They also caused me to infer the existence of a culprit somewhere. So I hid myself and watched the gate. Presently the horse came and pulled the pin out with his teeth and went in. Nobody taught him that. He had observed, then thought it out for himself. His process did not differ from Edison's. He put this and that together and drew an inference. And the peg too, but I made him sweat for it. For Twain, the peculiar habit of mind, his fixed belief, to use Peirce's phrase, was an unwavering, if often exasperated, belief in democracy as a superior form of government in combination with a more or less deterministic social psychology. Together, these became his guiding principle. And eventually, it permitted, even determined him to jettison earlier biases, to oversimplify. If training is everything, and if democracy is one's precious belief, then the only profitable inference one can draw is that gender and race are social constructions that have no basis in biological fact. That the office of democracy is to offer the greatest number of opportunities to the greatest number of its citizens. This is not principally a moral dilemma. Instead, it is a political and social question. In order for democracy to work, it must foster the talents of its most meritorious members, through emancipation and the vote, surely, but also through education, incentive, and the like. The social changes involved here have little or nothing to do with sympathetic or benevolent feelings. They are adaptations a political institution must make in order for that institution in its own struggle for existence to survive. I am using Darwinian terminology deliberately here, and to do so is to place Twain's notion of democracy on rather different footing than we are sometimes disposed to think of it. Thomas Jefferson, for example, banked on the innate moral sympathies of the country's lowliest citizens. Jefferson derived much of his own guiding principle from reading the Scotch common sense philosophers, and came to believe that the plowman was more likely to solve moral dilemmas than the professor. Those are Jefferson's examples. Because morally, the plowman was not confused by artificial rules of conduct, and instead was responsible to a, quote, generous spasm of the heart. One may like to think that in his decision to help Jim, Huck Finn experienced such an expansion of his sympathies in ways that overruled his training. But I personally doubt it. Mark Twain took a different tack. Man is essentially selfish, though he found curious exceptions in the recorded conduct of Joan of Arc and the Filipino liberator Emilio Aguinaldo. This selfishness is not to be lamented. On the contrary, insofar as the common citizen believes that he or she has a stake in society, the welfare of a democratic state is a cultivated habit of mind. In a word, it is in one's individual interest to want a genuine meritocracy to prevail. We sometimes like to suppose that Mark Twain is meaningful to us today because his heart was in the right place. That may be so, but if it is, I am convinced that it was his head that brought him there. In these closing remarks, you may think I have drifted a good long ways from Twain's attitude toward the insanity defense. You are right, but in a sudden passion of feeling, I guess I was not in my right mind. That said, I will open this up for questions. You may or may not have noticed that along the way I have salted this talk with remarks designed to elicit questions. On the other hand, I have no idea what my response to the sort of questions I anticipate might be. If that isn't the work of an out-and-out lunatic, I don't know what is. Thank you. I went a little bit over, but I'm glad to take questions. You have them. I pass them out to certain people. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Quirk. Really put you on the spot here, sir. How would Twain observe the current Democratic election?
Would that he were here. Well, I'm going to evade your question. Certainly in matters of capacity. He would be very, very happy to see a woman and an African American at long last in the race. Because, as I believe, if training is everything, some people got left out of the bargain on the basis of assigning certain limitations that simply aren't there. That said, as you may know from some of his late works, he was very cynical about democratic process. In fact, he has to take his ambitions all the way to heaven in Captain Stormfield's visit to heaven, principally because of greed and conniving and double dealing and all kinds of other ways in which America has gone wrong. So if you ask me who he'd vote for, I have no idea. If you're asking me were he a political satirist in our own time, we can revive some of the things he said late in his life. For example, he complained about this nation is now raising its children to be patriots and not citizens. I think that's a very telling remark about our possibilities. he rewrote the catechism in which our new God is money, and he thought that we want too much. Of course, that he did too. Exactly, he did too. And he did say one time that I have studied, I contain everything that human nature has within my own self, and so I know it firsthand. He knew it, and he knew our own limitations. In the final analysis, I think he was rather hopeful for our possibilities, if we could only be less timid, and if there were a few courageous ones among us. I can elaborate on some of his optimism if you want. And one of the things in 19th century notions of progress, which were tied to Darwinian notions, it became clear to Herbert Spencer and Mark Twain, as it became clear to Hank Morgan in the course of Connecticut Yankee, that progress takes a whole long time. If it's a biological process, it takes, and remember, Hank Morgan's going to, in 2 or 3 years, transform Camelot. Then it's 10 or 20 years, then it's a generation or two, and then he kind of gives it up. Because it's just such a slow process. And I think Twain himself despaired of progress being quick enough to bring the sorts of changes that are needed. One of the ways that he answered this, and I traced the intellectual roots of it, is man and woman's natural tendency to imitate. As he says in Cornpone and Opinions, everyone laughs at the hoop skirt one year and everyone's wearing it the next year. So, still it is that sense of imitation that can accelerate the process of change a good long time. We know, we're so familiar with this in terms of rock stars and iPods and other things that change can be affected quickly. And of course we have a phrase for it now as role models. There are too few of them, I suppose. There are too few of the right sorts. But kids quickly imitate their betters, those they perceive to be their betters, and we just hope they perceive the right ones, I guess. So he was hopeful in a limited and a circumspect way. Any other questions? Yeah?
In terms of today, if he were here today, where would he see progress in comparison to his time?
One would hope that he would place less faith in technological progress and more faith in human progress. He placed a lot of faith in mere technological progress, which environmentally has gotten us into a whole lot of trouble. So I would hope that he would say there's progress and then there's progress. And he's equipped to do both because he was the beneficiary here and down in Hartford of all kinds of technological improvements. One of the first people on his block to have a telephone, for example, and other conveniences. And yet, in his last years, he drifts back to a pre-technological childhood in his autobiography and elsewhere, with genuine fondness for some things and shame, most particularly for slavery and others. So, he would be equipped to say, we can live a simpler way, I think. I remember. We did it. So, Gretchen is bearing the chalice now. Excuse me, Barbara. Gretchen's there.
I knew who you were talking about.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Quirk.